kind of summary of what's gone before. Unfortunately, it was a summary that was prepared before the conference. So I would like to invoke the Buddhist sense of non-self, right, of anatman. And so you can sort of share with me what this other person did before he had the knowledge gained from this conference, as you see what we can correct together as a much better effort as we go along. Okay. I want to see the Yoga Sutra in the context, as many have, of wider systems of thought and trends within classical Indian thought. And first of all, I'd like to point out that yoga practice, did we get there? Yeah, yoga practice, which I'm going to take as defined for the purposes of this talk, this summer, as many have here. This is kind of lucky for my former self, dead now, it's defined by the Ashtanga Yoga of the Yoga Sutra. Not that that's the only practice that's outlined in the Yoga Sutra, and sometimes we have, as we have in chapter 1, the individual elements of the Ashtanga Yoga, the pranayama and so on, are looked upon as individually capable of taking one to the goal of yoga as chitta, vritti, nirodha. But taking that as a way of getting a grasp on yoga practice, because yoga practice does, over the time with the development of Tantra, become more diverse than Ashtanga Yoga, the Yoga Sutra. Nevertheless, in the context of the philosophy, there's a sort of common saying among pundits that yoga sarva bandhava. Yoga is the friend of all the philosophies. All the philosophies in classical India, just about. Now, let's look at them. But at least many of them do espouse, advocate yoga practice. So we have, of course, we have to distinguish between yoga, maybe with a capital Y, the view of the Yoga Sutra that's put forth, and yoga practices with a lowercase y, as commonly done among scholars. And there's this group grouping of Astika, Nastika, and so on, that, well, is useful maybe as a first pass. I think Astika, what it really amounts to is being shishta, being not accepting particular views. I don't think there's anything that's really required to be Astika across the board in all the philosophies, but rather to be shishta, that is to be educated in a certain way, cultured in a certain way, such as what I didn't do, namely chant Om before beginning a class. And let me back up, Om. That's Mangaladachanam. You should always set a mood by setting it, but I guess it's been set before, so I can be forgiven. In any case, I want to focus mainly on Vedanta and Nyaya along with yoga. The Nastika philosophies also embrace yoga practices, not Charvaka, but the Bala and the Jaina, and then of course there are lots of other views, the Pashupata, as we've heard about, the Bhagavata, the Pratyabhijna view of in Kashmiri Shaivism and so on, where very clearly yoga practices are endorsed. Now, coming to the Yoga Sutra, this is hardly a revolutionary interpretation, but the Yoga Sutra, I think we have to keep in mind, has three faces, has a triple character. And it is, on the one hand, a how-to book. It's spelling out how to practice yoga, and giving us descriptions of various disciplines. It's also, as I think Ian Weeder has wonderfully brought out, it's a textbook of psychology. In fact, I think that he's absolutely right, and also in Bryant, in stressing that the project of the Yoga Sutra is not this third item, its third face of its triple faces, being a dualist metaphysical treatise. I think it also has that. I think there are certain sutras that read as deductions from a metaphysically or ontologically dualist perspective. And so some sutras are to be read top-down as deductions from Sankhya premises, but others, in the spirit of the other two faces of the Yoga Sutra, are surely to be read bottom-up as discoveries of the yoga practice and of the yoga experience. Now, Surendranath Dasgupta, the great scholar of classical Indian philosophies who wrote a 5-volume history of Indian philosophy, that's dated in many ways, particularly with the later volumes. But he started this idea that Patanjali had collected sutras that were used by previous practitioners of yoga over the centuries, and that he edited them to a whole. So he says Patanjali was probably the most notable person of a certain school of Sankhya, for he not only collected the different forms of yoga practice and gleaned the diverse ideas which were to be associated with the yoga, but grafted them all on the Sankhya metaphysics and gave them the form in which they have been handed down to us. Vajrasattva and Vijnana Bhikshu agree with us in holding that Patanjali was not the founder of the yoga, but an editor. And then according to Dasgupta, there are two main principles of this editing. First of all, or as I say here, the unification of the text. First of all, the breadth of inclusion of yoga practices. This I call a methodological pluralism. Now, it may be, as Panditji here was pointing out, where is he? There he is. That va doesn't necessarily mean being an alternative. Nevertheless, those in chapter 1 in particular, where we do get a long list of separate practices that can lead to the goal of yoga as chitta vritti nirodha, gosh, I have to rethink this. And so this is my old self, right? I mean, the old self of Va said that indicated a methodological pluralism in that there are not so different ways that one can achieve chitta vritti nirodha. I'm not sure if your interpretation was, well, we should interpret that Va as cha or something, that it's really all these wishes are required, but that we can come to some discussion of that later on.
It was definitely Natha tradition and Sri Vidya tradition oriented interpretation, which has very little respect for Vachaspati Misra.
Okay. Be that as it may, it seems to me that that Patanjali, in the psychological dimension, has one really great concept that reverberates in many of the other schools of classical Indian philosophy, in particular Vedanta. And it's the concept of vritti. You know, we have the definition, chittas, yogas, chitta vritti nirodha, and then, okay, what are the vrittis? Well, you might say, well, what's chitta? By the way, chitta seems to me to be a bridge concept, as Ian Witter and many others were pointing out. You know, chitta is an unusual part of Prakriti in that it has intentionality. It has object. It's object directed. So we can become aware of our thought as a witness, so that the thought is an object of our consciousness, but thought also is directed towards something outside itself, and so it has intentionality too. So could we call the yoga philosophy not a dualism, but a tripleism? A tripleism in that it has these bridge concepts that go across. Chitti Shakti is another one of these. Nevertheless, I digress. We have these vritti, and it's said that they're of 5 kinds, Panchatiya, Klishta, and then we're given pramana. That's something, pramana, that's knowledge and knowledge sources, perception, inference, testimony. Viparyaya, its opposite, vikalpa, imagination, nidra, sleep and dreaming, and memory. And it seems to me that to think of modifications of the mind as the way we know the world is really revolutionary. that at least it stands in stark contrast with the Nyaya. That's another school that I'm going to talk about. It develops from the Targa Shastra, or the textbooks on reasoning, where we have a contact model of sense perception in particular, where we think of vision, trained by science and so on, we think we have visual experience inside us, so to say. But in the Nyaya view, the self is vibhu, and so it's already pervading all of space. And so what happens with vision is it takes the element of the object, the sensory organ, and the self to make visual experience, and the visual organ travels on light and contacts the object, and it's sort of assimilating vision to touch, so that, I mean, this seems to be phenomenologically accurate, that we actually don't see the wall over there in our heads, in our own experience. We see it over there where it is. At least you can see why the Nyayikas and others have adopted this model of perception. But we have a very different model of perception in the Yoga Sutra, in the notion of a vritti, where this becomes enormously influential in later Vedanta, where the whole world is Chaitanya, and it's always the shaping of the world starts with the shaping of our vrittis as they turn and become one or the other. And even certain vrittis can remove avidya. So this is an enormous accomplishment, I think, that can be traced to Patanjali. Now, I do want to talk about Vedanta here first, now after a little bit about the Yoga Sutra. And this is the worldview of the early Upanishads, which I think we should acknowledge. Granted, the Puranas are extremely important, and the Mahabharata and so on, but the worldview of the early Upanishads, the Upanishads are the founding texts of yoga philosophy and practice. It's in the Upanishads that we find yoga methods first mentioned, and also the goals of yoga. But as a classical darshana, now darshana is a whole systematic worldview. As a classical darshana, even though the Upanishads are very old, and there's some dispute about how old, 800 BCE, and the Chandogya may be so old too, and Isha. Maybe some of the others are about the time of the Buddha, 500 BCE, and so maybe Shrutashvata a little later, but still quite a bit earlier than the Mahabharata and the Puranas and so on, at least the 10 or 12 most commonly cited Upanishads. But, it's much later that it gets systematized, the philosophy of the Upanishads gets systematized as a worldview. And I think part of the systematization of Upanishadic philosophy has to do with seeing rival worldviews. That, to my mind, it doesn't really count as a darshana and the way we come to understand it in the midst of the classical period, unless there's some opposition to other ways of seeing the world and some arguments in favor of the one way of seeing and against the other way of seeing. And so I want to say that there is a philosophy in the earliest text of yoga, namely the Upanishads, but it's not systematic. The genre is not philosophy. There are lots of jokes in the Upanishads, false etymologies. Even the profound exposition of the Kata Upanishad, it seems to me that the whole frame story hinges on a very big joke. When Nachiketas is seeing his father give everything away in the traditional religious sacrifice, he bugs his father and says, "To whom will you give me?" And his father ignores him. He says it a second time and third time, as you know the story. And then finally his father says, "Go to hell." And Nachiketas, being a dutiful son, goes to hell. That's supposed to be the joke! When he goes to hell, there are kind of yogic trance. talks the Yama, and so on and so on. So the Upanishads are not sort of straightforward telling us about the way the world is and why, I don't know, Yoga Chitta Buddhism is wrong, etc., etc., or why, the Nyaya view is better than Vedanta. But we get that in the Brahma Sutra, which was, you mentioned that the Brahma Sutra is mentioned in the Moksha Dharma. No, it was some other place that I was surprised to hear. It was something that threw my normal chronology off. But maybe we'll come back to that again and ask you again. I need to correct my own self. In any case, within Vedanta, what really defines a sub-school of Vedanta, the Brahma Sutra makes the Vedanta a darshana. But what defines the sub-schools of Vedanta is an original commentary on the Brahma Sutra. And there are something like 17 of these, and maybe more these days. Now, I want to talk mainly about Advaita, and just because there's only so much time, I think one thing we really need to appreciate about looking at the yoga and the Yoga Sutra literature is just how small it is in comparison with the enormity of some of the literatures and the other schools, in particular Advaita Vedanta. Advaita Vedanta has, from the time of Shankara and his immediate disciples on to the present, gosh, you could count hundreds, probably hundreds, I'll stop with hundreds, of texts. I think I'm a little more circumspect. Well, no, I don't say how many. That's my own self. Vishishta Advaita has more than 400 texts. Somehow Karl Potter wrote me into being an editor for that volume of Vishishta Advaita. I never did anything except sort of look at just how much work there was to be done on that. And just after Sri Bhashya with Ramanuja, there are over 400 major philosophic texts in the Vishishta Advaita school, just to Vedanta Deshika. And then Vedanta Deshika starts a whole new thing with hundreds of more texts. So compared to the Vedanta literature, is my point here, is that the yoga literature doesn't seem to come up to the sort of inspiration of a whole full-fledged darshana. And this is something that I want to develop. Now, of course, there's the relation of the Veda and the Upanishads. The two senses of the word yoga, and that are both in the Gita, union and discipline. Let's sort of skip that and sort of make the case that the Upanishads are the foundational text. The Taittiriya Upanishad has a really interesting passage. Well, in the midst of its discussion of the 5 bodies that we live in simultaneously, the food body, the pranic body, the lower mental body, the Maya Purusha that we share with animals, and the higher mental body and the bliss body. In the midst of that, yoga is introduced in this very early Upanishad as part of this. It's the trunk of the 4th body, of the higher intellectual body. And I'm just speculating. It seems to me that maybe that's because, as Abhinavagupta will say much later, that, as he says, Tarka is the 9th limb of yoga, where he means that having an intellectual discipline, what the Bhagavad Gita calls buddhi yoga, and it's mentioned 3 or 4 times in the Bhagavad Gita, that having an intellectual plan for your discipline is crucial. You just, I don't know, the thing I love about going to contemporary yoga classes is you don't have to plan. The teacher tells you what to do. You don't have to. If you sit down at home, you have to have a mental plan that I can only stick to for about 5 minutes. But when you go to class, you have, Okay. All right. So, very clearly, with with the Mundaka Upanishad, we have, tapas mentioned, brahmacharya, that they perceive the self and so on. And then I know this next one has been already panned by Ed Bryant as getting way too much emphasis in the Shritashvatara Upanishad. But hey, it's there, right? I mean, we get the sitting in a certain way, right, in an asana, controlling the mind, etc., etc. Now, moving on to the Bhagavad Gita, the first question I would like to ask about the Bhagavad Gita is, are we wrong in thinking of the Brahma Sutra as the first systemization of Vedanta philosophy? Maybe it's the Bhagavad Gita, because the Bhagavad Gita pulls together lots of strands of the teachings of the Upanishads into a whole, should I say, worldview. And the Gita mentions the Brahma Sutra at 13.4, which is a little surprising, which makes you think that the Gita maybe is not as old as some have thought, or maybe the Brahma Sutra is a lot older.
Vedanta, not Vedanta, which just says I am Vedanta.
Oh,
So that could be a reference to the Upanishads.
okay, all right. I'll have to go look at that again. My former self makes lots of mistakes. The Gita is, it seems to me, I think plenty of people have brought this out in chapter 6. If it's not the, it's at least a principal source for the ideas of the Yoga Sutra, along all three of the dimensions that we mentioned of practice, but particularly of psychology and also of metaphysics. But the reason I want to say the Gita is not the first systematization of the philosophy of the Upanishads is that, well, it kind of rambles, it doesn't come out, it's stylistically direct as the later philosophies become, and the Brahma Sutra itself, lays things out very, very, very orderly fashion, and disputes with the other views are there are lots of arguments, and we don't really have any disputations of rival darshana in the Gita. There is criticism of ritualism. Those Vedantins, right? They're just nowhere. And there's also the Upanishads, as many have brought out, have talked about the interiorization of the sacrifice, and there's that karma yogic movement where you don't have to do those traditional sacrifices. You can make your whole life and everything that you do a sacrifice on the inner fire, the Nachiketa's fire, as it is called in the kind of Upanishads. But even though the Gita has, we want to say, some very interesting philosophic claims and teaching, I don't see it as amounting to the presentation of a darshana. Now, when we come to the first great commentator on the Brahma Sutra, Adi Shankara, there's been, it seems to me, a lot of confusion about the requirements for what the first sutra, Brahma Jinyasa, inquiry into Brahma. Who is eligible to make inquiry into Brahma? And here is where yoga comes into practice, because what Shankara has done, what he does right at the very beginning of this text in his commentary on Sutra 1, is to argue that the rituals are not the adhikata. You don't have to perform the rituals that have been specified by the Vedantins. What one has to have is in this often quoted line from the Upadesha Sahasri, that one gives the teaching to one shamadana dhyadi, to one who's endowed with the yogic qualities of peacefulness, self-control, and compassion. And then, as I was mentioning, his commentary on Sutra 1.1, between Atta Ato Brahma Jinyasa, Shankara, first, this Uchite is his answer. He's presented a Purva-paksha which says, you need to do all these rituals to have the right to inquire into Brahma. She says, and he's refuted that And we say, but what are the adhikara? And he says, nitya nitya vastu viveka, iha mudra artha bhoga viraga, shamadayadi sadhana sampat, mumukshutvam cha. We answer, now give the right view of the prerequisites, adhikara for inquiry into Brahman, discrimination of the eternal and the non-eternal, that's almost a direct quote of the Yoga Sutra. Disinterest in enjoyment of objects in this or another world, perfection or accomplishment, sampat of the means to peacefulness, self-control and the like, and mumukshutva, desire for liberation. This clearly, to me, shows that Shankara is looking upon yoga practice as what is absolutely crucial for inquiry, for intellectual inquiry into Brahman. Now, there are lots of lines of cross-fertilization between Vedanta and the Yoga Sutra. This is my main theme, and I think many people who've spoken at this conference have brought much more than I can bring out here in a kind of summary, but particularly in the psychological dimension. Again, as Ed Bryant says, this, where Vedanta borrows from the Yoga Sutra, and there's sort of this cross-fertilization, is in the psychological realm. The project of the Yoga Sutra being mainly psychological, in my view, and I've been convinced of this even more by Ian Wigger's talk, that yes, we have these notions like vasana, samskara, and vritti itself that just flow back seamlessly, back and forth between the two sets of literature. Next, there's the theory of the three gunas, right? Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. And it's not the only way of nature. And by the way, these gunas, even though you could have the cosmological reading of these gunas as the constituents of everything, and Shankara, by the way, gives the decisive refutation of the dualism of an unconscious pradana, looking upon sattva, rajas, and tamas as kind of atoms. That somehow, though this beautiful world that's arranged so perfectly could be the result of unconscious forces, atoms, these atoms just sort of arranging themselves by chance. He takes special effort to refute that, and his refutation is based upon not only the beauty of the universe, but also about the impossibility on a strict dualism where there's no what we might call a non-interactive dualism as opposed to an interactive dualism, which, as I'll explain, that's the Nyaya view. On a non-interactive dualism where Purusha and Prakriti are really separate, which I think they're not in the Yoga Sutra, but given that you're thinking that way, Shankara has a decisive refutation. How is it possible to act? He's talking about our everyday perspective. If the action is taken away from the self, and of course this is directed against Sankhya, but as people have pointed out, he takes his refutation of Sankhya to also apply to yoga, and it's all premised on, his reputation is premised on a strict non-interactive dualism. But, that doesn't keep him from talking at length about sattva, rajas, and tamas, as does the Yoga Sutra. And the Yoga Sutra, I think, is not using those terms ontologically or cosmologically in the main. They're actually talking about our personal nature and the importance of transforming it into sattva and having a certain empowerment and transformation, as Ian said. In any case, that theory is, I don't know. I used to think it was a little simplistic in the Gita. This kind of food is sattvic, this kind of food is rajasic, this kind of food is tamasic, and so on. But I don't know, as I've gotten older, I think that, you need a kind of simple classification for these sorts of things, and it is quite useful in guiding a yoga practice. And there's the notion of yoga as chitta vritti nirodha, the mental silence. This is, of course, this specified, I have to move on, okay? It's specified in the Yoga Sutra and the Gita. And then avidya is another point, where it seems to me there's just the elaboration and metaphysics of spiritual ignorance. The two literatures borrow much from each other. Moving on to yoga and Nyaya. Again, my main point is going to be that yoga, here are the main yoga texts. And then when you come to Nyaya, particularly when you get into the later period, I've been working a lot on Vachaspati, but even before Vachaspati, and then with Udayana and afterwards, they're just scores of works. And whereas with yoga, there's not much more. My point is that I think yoga, the way yoga is seen in the other schools, such as Nyaya and Vedanta, is not really as a competitor. It's not really a worldview that is a competitor, but it gives us all sorts of psychological material that we can incorporate, assimilate into our own view and find useful for our own purposes of sketching out the possibility of liberation and transformation. And both of them, I think both, the Nyaya starts with Tarkashastra, which means the science and textbooks of reasoning. And then it develops into a whole worldview with the Yoga Sutra, where we have positions on all the topics of the day and lots of engagement with other schools, in particular the Buddhist Yogacara. And by the way, if the Yoga Sutra is not engaging with Yogacara in chapter 4 and 15, 14, 15, and so on, that even more makes my case that it's not really a full-fledged darshana. It's as everyone says, it's Yoga Shastra. It's how to do yoga and the sort of psychological teachings that underpin that. And the whole metaphysical view that admittedly is overstressed. Stuart will get to, I'm giving a talk at the World Sanskrit Conference in July, where I'm going to elaborate Nyaya Sutra 4.2.38-39 about where there's a lot of talk of yoga, but I'm running out of time, and so let me just go quickly to Vachaspati, who wrote, well, some people sort of expect that Vachaspati, he's such a fantastic yoga commentator that it must be that shaping his other views. Well, it's true, but he also takes from his studies, there's a Tattva Bindu where he's writing a commentary on Mimamsa, and he's focused on the issue of sentence meaning, and he just takes that, it's almost like copy and paste, right? Self-plagiarism. He just takes a passage from his earlier work and imparts it over into his commentary on 317, which is about the city of understanding the cries of animals, and what he has to say is very much in the philosophic debate schema, and not really very much to do with cities. Then, just to move quickly, Geshe, the founder of Navya, has all this stuff about yoga, so yoga is extremely important in Nyaya, and I mean that to illustrate the thesis that, as pundits say, yoga is the friend of all the philosophy. So just to close, the main differences we have is in yoga, we have this notion of self-awareness, aware self-illuminatingly, or self-illuminatingly, maybe is a better word. And I'm wondering, how do we know that? Because the philosophers are obsessed with how we know the pramana, because the pramana are not only the methods that generate knowledge, but they're also, by citing pramana, by citing our methods or sources of knowledge, we justify our positions and defend them in philosophic debate, as augmented by tarka or dialectical reasoning. And it's not clear to me exactly how this is known, but there's a sort of idea that it's reachable in samadhi. the Atman in yoga is not an agent. It's a witness, sort of. I mean, everyone says it's a witness, a sakshi, and that's an old Upanishadic idea. But, you know, a witness requires witnessing. The very logic of witness is connected to witnessing. So I'm not so sure I want to put that attribution on the yoga. Clearly it's distinct from the body, though it can also, its realization have profound effects on the body. With Advaita Vedanta, we have a similar notion of self-awareness, aware self-illuminatingly. It's reachable in samadhi. Samadhi is called Brahma Sakshatkara. And then it said it's unknowable otherwise. That, you know, the perspective on the world from Brahma Sakshatkara, or Brahman's own perspective on the world, is, I think, should not be characterized as Maya. That's just a metaphor. The real point is that it's not knowable. That we can't presume to see the absolute's perspective on the world and express it in world. It's also not an agent witness. The same problem with witness is there as in yoga. With Nyaya we have, what you want to say, I think slightly, you know, more dialectical move. I mean, sort of achieve a certain kind of sophistication with long arguments with Buddhists in particular. There is we have self-awareness, and right now, when we say, I don't know, introspectively, I see that I am seeing a table. What does I mean? You know, people have been talking about how we get a sense of a whole body, even though we don't see the back. Well, we don't see the whole self. But we see the self-seeing, which is some aspect or characteristic of the self qualifying the self while the seeing is going on. And so we have self-awareness through apperception. But it's not self-illuminating in Nyaya. That we know also the self not only through the sense through a kind of apperception or a kind of perception, there's an internal perception. It's also inferable through diachronic recognition. This is that Joseph Prabhu that I saw a long time ago, and if I were not the same person, gosh, this is, see, my thesis is refuted now. I started off as a Buddhist, but now I'm going to have to reveal myself as my true colors as a Nyayika. Look, if I were not the same person who saw Joseph many years ago, I wouldn't be able to recognize him now. It's not the point that Joseph hadn't changed. James very much looks really good. Two people don't have, this one person doesn't have another person's memories, and so there has to be something that unites the past and the present in me for me to be able to recognize them. Similarly, with synchronic unification, where we put two senses together, it has agency, right? The Nyaya holds, very interested in yoga, and holds that we should be seeking samadhi. And those sutras that I skipped over, that I'll talk about another time, they have this goal that they totally embrace yoga, but they want to think that qualifying the self is a kind of desire to do, that the self is it's a property bearer of property. So they have a certain a kind of ontology that is different from that of Vedanta and yoga. And so a self has knowledge, has mental life, and then of course it is distinct from a body. Well, this is just some of the ways in which the classical darshanas both argue with each other and also try to incorporate some of the great insights of yoga, psychology, and practice. Well, it's been a great conference, and I thank you for your attention.
Come those references between the Nyaya and the Yoga, I suddenly remembered the therapeutic paradigm, which was not mentioned here in the last 2 days, the Heya Heya He Tu Hana Hanupaya, which occurs interestingly in the second chapter of Patanjali and more explicitly in Vyasa, but also, as you know, in Vatsyayana's commentary of Nyaya Sutta 111. So maybe you can say something about the therapeutic paradigm.
Well,
Noble truth also, of course.
well, yes. For Nyaya, even though the self is the locus of psychological properties such as desire to do and so on, and the locus of samskaras, not in prakriti. So that's the main difference. Nevertheless, it's even though we know through philosophic argument and analysis that the self is distinct from the body, the self is reborn, etc., is capable of samadhi, which is an awareness that is not dependent upon the body. Even though we know this intellectually, we need to practice yoga to firm it up. We need to practice yoga in order to make it bhavana, to make it come to life, to make it really real in our lives. And so yoga is, from the get-go, in that spirit, embraced by Vatsyayana and every Nyayika that I know of.
Stephen, thank you. Two questions. One very quick one. Do you know when the Bhagavad Gita gets plucked out of the epic and becomes part of the Prasthana triad? Is anything been written about that? And my main question is, why doesn't Patanjali define chitta? He's very careful about giving definitions of kleshas and vrittis. And the reason this becomes, and it's the central term, right? Because really it's the chitta liberating itself from itself. And the reason this becomes an issue is because in the commentators take chitta as being manas, buddhi, and ahankara. But in Vedanta, chitta is the fourth feature. It's memory. That's in addition to manas, buddhi, and ahankara. So given that there were alternative notions of what a chitta was, and given it's the central term in Patanjali, do you have any speculation about why he didn't define? I mean, I thought maybe, he defines the vrittis, and after all, you can only, so in that sense he's defining the chitta, but do you have anything you care to
Well, first of all, about the Bhagavad Gita, and I've been reading Shankara lately again, and he's such a good writer, and my sense, I get the sense that maybe Shankara wrote the Gita. because for one thing, you know how hard it is to read Mahabharata. There are all these, there isn't this story about, that because Ganesha's writing it down, that there's a lot of sort of faulty syntax and odd vocabulary, etc., etc. But look at Gita, stuff like that. It's so clear. It's so smooth and everything. And Shankara's commentary makes it even more so. His commentary is just one of the most lucid texts in all of Sanskrit literature. So I'm starting to think that Shankara wrote the Gita and put, I know that's not true, but you tell me, is there any evidence before Shankara that the Gita was abstracted from the Mahabharata? Is there any citation of the Gita earlier than Shankara?
Gita is part of the Mahabharata.
Yeah, I know, but it was taken out of the Mahabharata and Shankara writes a commentary on just the Gita, none of the else of the Mahabharata, not the Moksha Dharma, nothing else. And he starts a trend of, all the Vedantins. Ramanuja didn't, but a lot of his disciples wrote Gita commentaries, and in all the other schools of Vedanta, they're commentaries on the Gita. So when did this practice start of taking the Gita out of the context of the Mahabharata and treating it, on its own? I mean, does anybody have any notion of that?
Shankara mentions that there have been many commentaries, and
Well,
therefore he needs to write it.
But you can't trust Shankara. That he may just be self-depreciating, right? Because everyone says that. Everyone says, oh, I didn't, that's not me. I've gotten it from the ancient rishis who were my teachers. They're very humble, just the opposite of my colleagues in philosophy departments, who rob from everyone without giving them credit, right? but yeah, so I don't know if Shankara can be trusted on that. But anyway, for the second question, I really don't have the answer on chitta, except that, particularly in chapter 4 of, in the fourth part of the Yoga Sutra, chitta has this enormous significance as a kind of battleground between, it sort of seems like the chitti, that there is a power of the purusha to control chitta. And in fact, on that sutra 4.4 that Ian quoted, the Bhashya even talks about yogis having the ability to make new chitta. And so I hazard this as an interpretation. I know this may be a bit speculative, but it's almost as though you think that sort of conventional mindsets, sort of conventional ideas flow in society. We sort of think the same thoughts that everybody does. And so nature controls our minds, our society, our setting. But the purusha, through its exertion of control, trying to exert control of the chitta, is really sort of a battle with conventionality, to take control. So then we get, it seems to me with this idea of making new chitta, we make sort of room for the kind of the Kashmiri Shaivite move that, that the yogin is an artist that receives inspiration in a quiet mind. I mean, Gita says Shiva sort of speaks through the guru, and so they're sort of making new chitta. So it seems like there's a kind of battleground. Chitta is the battleground for. So I wasn't just joking when I called it a tripleism. There's purusha, prakriti, and chitta in the middle.
Your talk made me think again of the notion of adhikara, especially with regard to Patanjali's first sutra, Atha Yoganushasana. And I think this Anushasana, don't speak about now about Anushasana, but the Atha, what was before? I mean, what made actually the readers, the listeners of the Yoga Sutra of adhikara? And when you mentioned Shankaracharya's Upanishads, which I think is a wonderful kind of a masterpiece, and then it starts exactly with this. Then the question is the emergence of curiosity or openness towards the teaching. And this is what is Atha, Ato, Brahma Jijñāsa. Brahma Jijñāsa is actually curiosity or sort of openness to hear. And I think that in Shankara's view, yoga is in some respects the constitution of adhikara, to listen to the teaching. This is what I think about the Upanishads first and second chapter. Actually, they mention all sorts of yogic characteristics which makes the student, the disciple of adhikara, yes, of curiosity. Yes. The emergence of curiosity is, I think, a very interesting kind of a concept which make this cross-reference of yours to yoga and Shankara's Advaita fruitful, of some fertility.
Yes, I agree with everything that you said. Indeed, yoga is at least one of the adhikara for Brahma Jijñāsa. And it goes beyond curiosity, it also includes mumukshutva, right? I mean, the desire for liberation. But this is all premised, the prerequisite, right, on sort of taking the advanced course, is somewhat real mastery of yogic practices. And also, at the very beginning of the Brahma Sutra Bhashya, right, where he's explaining Atta, right, as involving a sense of sequentiality. It's not, I mean, sometimes Atta can be used just as Mangala Bhashya, right, like Om setting a, it's a not quite a state of his own, but it's a good way to start any text, Atta. But he very eloquently establishes that Atta, in this case, means this kind of sequentiality, that this follows on certain prerequisites. And those prerequisites include very dramatically accomplishment in yoga practices. Now, what the Atta as the beginning of the Yoga Sutra, I don't remember the Bhashya on that. But
it says Adhikara Atta.
Also Adhikara,
but not as a certain qualification, but as setting the topic of what is going on.
Setting the topic.
To be dealt with.
Right, so that's a little
just
different.
a heading.
Just a heading, so it's not sequentiality.
No.
It's not sequentiality in the Yoga Sutra. There's your answer. Okay, very good.
Just a quick comment to sort of validate your thesis about cross-fertilization. It seems to me that if you look at the work of all the gurus and swamis and yogacharyas who actually teach and reach people, they all draw from a variety of sources. They're Vedantists, they draw from Tantra, and they teach yogic practices. And they're sort of, they do what engineers do, and draw from whatever scientific discipline or discovery can be applied in the real world to have an impact. And so that would seem to be, I guess my question is, wouldn't you agree that that's kind of a validation of the cross-fertilization that probably always went on the applied level?
Yes, I was deeply plunged into Ganesha's Tattva Chintamani and was surprised to find him mentioning the Yoga Sutra. But the way he did it was not as a Purva-paksha, not as an opponent, but just as a sort of, it's part of core literature. Any educated person has read the Yoga Sutra. Any person in any darshana or any sort of intellectual craft, it knows the Yoga Sutra is part of the core literature. It doesn't mean that we agree with it in every part of it, but it's a great resource for what we want to do. And so it seems to me that's the main way the Yoga Sutra is handled in the other schools of philosophy. Admittedly, Shankara does explicitly refute Sankhya dualism, but it's a certain understanding of the Sankhya dualism. It's the understanding of the Sankhya dualism as I say, a trenchant dualism, a non-interactive dualism, where consciousness, the principles that of Prakriti are really not governed by Purusha, whereas the Naiyayikas are interactive dualism. They think that there can be mental causes of physical events, physical causes of mental events, mental causes of mental events, physical causes of physical events. They just say, well, that's just a question to decide, right? I mean, your next thought was partially caused by your previous thought. That's a mental cause of a mental event. And there's also mental causes of physical events, like this, and so on. So I think there's good reason to prefer an interactive dualism to a non-interactive dualism, as Shankara points out. It makes understanding, knowledge, and action possible. But that's not really Patanjali, right? I mean, to think that Patanjali is this sort of strict ontological, I mean, just sort of this metaphysical treatise proposing a non-interactive relationship between these two realities that really don't have anything to do with each other, and it's all illusion of action and illusion and so on. Well, there may be some of that. As I said, there is a certain metaphysical cast to that, but the very notion of chitta and other bridge notions in the Yoga Sutra, and as Ian is talking about, getting right with Prakriti, is an essential part of the text. And furthermore, it seems to me that unlike the classical darshana, Patanjali, and maybe less so if we can separate the two, and I don't know if we can, Vyasa and his Bhashya, Patanjali is not so interested in consistency. I mean, coherence and consistency, right? There is also a hallmark of a systematic worldview, and I just don't think that that's paramount in Patanjali's mind. It's not his project, as Ed Bryant said. So that makes the cross-fertilization easier. It's not like we're just bad. I mean, there's also borrowing from Yogacara Buddhists, right? They had the notion of nirvikopika pradyaksha, of concept, non-concept laden perception, which the Nayayikas didn't have, but through their influence, the Nayayikas developed and assimilated into their own, well, not only their influence, but also the influence of Kumara Bhatta and others into their system. But they're very reluctant